He'd poisoned me, his own neighbor. He moved into my house as if it belonged to him. But what he didn't know was that karma was already coming for him, and when it did, it hit harder than he could ever imagined. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. I lived in Cedar Hills, Ohio, a quiet, suburban neighborhood where people still waved at each other while mowing lawns and where kids raced bikes until the streetlights came on. To outsiders, Cedar Hills looked perfect. Neatly painted homes, trimmed hedges, neighbors who brought over pies when someone moved in. It was the kind of place where you felt safe, leaving your doors unlocked. I thought I knew every face, every habit, every rhythm of my block. But I didn't know that the man across the street, the man who smiled at me, nodded when I passed by, and sometimes helped me carry heavy bags, was quietly plotting my end. His name was Calvin Rhodes. Calvin was in his mid-40s, always looking like life had worn him down more than it should have. His shirts were wrinkled, his car always needed a wash, and he had that permanent look of dissatisfaction etched on his face. I didn't pay much attention at first. Every neighborhood has a guy like that, the one who grumbles about property taxes at block meetings, the one who never seems happy no matter how good things are. But Calvin's eyes told me something his words didn't. He watched me. He watched my house, he watched my yard, my truck, even the way people greeted me at church on Sundays. And I could feel it, the envy, the bitterness. I wasn't rich, not by a long shot, but I worked my way up, spent 35 years in logistics, and finally retired. My house wasn't a mansion, just a good-sized home with a wide porch, a grill out back, and space for family barbecues. I kept the grass short, planted roses for my late wife, and tried to be the kind of neighbor people respected. Folks around Cedar Hills knew me for hosting cookouts, volunteering at the local food pantry, and keeping an open chair for anyone who wanted to sit and talk. That kind of respect, the kind you earn slowly, year by year, was something Calvin never had, and I think it burned him alive inside. It started small. A glare across the street when my daughter, Angela, came by with her kids and they played tag in the yard. A muttered comment at the diner when someone congratulated me on the neighborhood award for community service. But bitterness is like a seed. It grows when you don't pull it out. One evening I found a letter in my mailbox. No return address, just 6 words written in messy block letters. A friend is not what he seems. At first, I thought it was a prank, maybe some kid fooling around. But a week later, another letter came. Watch who smiles at you. Not all smiles are real. I didn't know what to make of it. Should I tell the police, show the neighbors, or just toss it in the trash and forget it? Something in me said to keep them, so I slid both into a drawer in my desk. Life went on, but I noticed Calvin more. The way he lingered at his window whenever I had company, how he sometimes walked his trash to the curb at the exact moment I was outside. I brushed it off as coincidence, but I can't lie, his eyes made me uneasy. Still, I was raised to give the people the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he just needed a friend. And so, when he walked over one afternoon and said, "Hey Martin, need a hand with that lawnmower?" I smiled and let him help. That was my mistake. Weeks turned into months. Calvin became a regular presence around my place. He'd wave from across the street, sometimes bring over a 6-pack, sometimes borrow tools he never returned. People in the neighborhood started saying, "Looks like you and Calvin are finally getting along." But those letters haunted me. One night after a long day, I sat on the porch, reading through them again. My stomach tightened. Was I being paranoid? Or was someone trying to warn me about the very man who now sat at my table drinking my beer? Cedar Hills was the kind of town where people trusted too easily. We left our lives open, mailboxes unguarded, doors unlocked, trust given without much question. But trust can be dangerous. It can blind you to the enemy standing right in front of you. Looking back now, I should have paid closer attention. The signs were there. The envy in his stare, the way he lingered, the letters that grew more urgent. But I didn't. and that mistake would cost me everything. I thought Cedar Hills was the safest place in the world. I thought I knew my neighbors, but what I didn't know was that the real danger was standing right across the street, smiling at me like a friend. If you lived in a neighborhood like mine and someone warned you about a friend who wasn't what he seemed, would you believe it or would you ignore it? Tell me in the comments. And before I continue, make sure you subscribe to Heat Stories because the next chapter reveals how envy can turn deadly and you won't want to miss what happened next.
I should have seen it coming. While I opened my home to him, he was already planning how to take it from me. And the first step was poison. Calvin Rhodes wasn't always the man who lived across the street. Before Cedar Hills, he had a trail of failures behind him, though most people in town didn't know the details. I found out later that he used to run a small shipping company in Cincinnati. At first, it looked promising. He rented a warehouse, hired a few drivers, tried to grow the business, but the contracts dried up, his workers left, and before long, the company collapsed under unpaid loans. He came to Cedar Hills carrying the weight of those failures, and while he never said it out loud, the bitterness never left him. He'd sit at the diner with his shoulders hunched, staring down at his coffee like the world had cheated him. I was nothing more than a reminder of everything he didn't have. A house that wasn't falling apart, a family that still visited, friends who stopped by just to check in, respect from the community, and respect is something Calvin could never buy.
I didn't just get sick, I vanished. One day I was here. The next, my house fell silent, and my neighbor wasted no time moving in. The coughing fits grew worse. My hands trembled, my legs felt weak, and food barely stayed down. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, drenched in sweat, wondering what was happening to me. The doctors weren't much help. After a quick exam, one suggested it might be the flu, another thought maybe food poisoning. They ran basic tests, but nothing concrete came back. I was sent home with painkillers and advice to get some rest. Rest didn't help. Calvin came around more than ever, showing up at my door with bags of groceries, offers to mow the lawn, even casseroles he claimed he made himself. Every time I looked at his face, I remembered the smile he gave me while I coughed over that glass of lemonade. Still, I was too weak to fight him off, too tired to argue. Neighbors began whispering. At the diner, folks leaned in, lowering their voices when they saw me come through the door. At the pharmacy, the clerk asked softly if I needed help walking to my car. Even Pastor Bennett pulled me aside after church one Sunday. "Martin, people are worried. You don't look well. Are you sure you're all right?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Just a bug, Pastor. I'll be fine." But even I didn't believe myself anymore. The turning point came one Friday evening. I collapsed in the kitchen. My daughter Angela rushed over and insisted I go to the hospital. Calvin, of course, was already there, volunteering to drive me. He made a show of it, holding my arm, patting my back, telling Angela not to worry. But I saw the look in his eyes when the doctors wheeled me away. That same calculating stare, like a man watching a chess piece move exactly where he wanted it. I spent several days in the hospital, drifting in and out of sleep. Nurses checked on me, machines beeped, doctors muttered about running more tests. My body felt like it belonged to someone else. Then suddenly, things went dark. Angela told me later that I was transferred for further observation, but for me, it felt like I simply vanished. One day, I was in that hospital bed. The next, I was gone. My house in Cedar Hills went quiet. The porch lights stayed off. The grill out back collected dust. And that's when Calvin made his move. Within days, he was living in my house. He told neighbors I'd asked him to watch over the place. He even claimed I wanted him to handle my affairs while I was away. People were uneasy, but nobody had proof to challenge him. After all, I wasn't there to say otherwise. Calvin changed things quickly. He redecorated, moved furniture around, even parked his beat-up truck in my driveway as if he owned the place. I can only imagine what people thought walking past and seeing him wave from my porch as like nothing had happened. But not everyone was fooled. Deborah Whitfield, who lived 2 doors down, had always been sharp-eyed. She'd been in Cedar Hills longer than anyone and noticed everything. And one night, she saw something she couldn't forget. She swore she saw Calvin carrying a box, large, heavy, out of his old house and into my garage. It was late, close to midnight, and he moved quickly, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. Deborah said later that her gut told her something was wrong. That box wasn't trash. It wasn't tools. It was something he didn't want anyone to see. She didn't confront him right then, but she made a decision that would later change everything. She started watching him. Meanwhile, the community grew restless. At the diner, folks whispered, "Why's Calvin living there now? Did Martin really give him permission? Doesn't seem right, does it?" But without answers, people said nothing. Angela came by one afternoon only to find Calvin on my porch acting like the new owner. "My dad didn't ask you to move in," she told him firmly. "He wanted me to keep an eye on the place, until he's better." Angela didn't buy it, but she was shaken. Without me there, she didn't know how to fight him. From that point on, suspicion grew. Neighbors noticed Calvin avoiding questions. They noticed how quickly he settled in, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. But the truth was, he had been waiting, and the real proof of that would come soon enough. Deborah's suspicion grew stronger, and she began keeping quiet notes of everything she saw. But what none of us realized yet was that my disappearance was only the beginning of Calvin's downfall. If your neighbors suddenly moved into someone else's house within days of them disappearing, what would you think? Would you confront them or stay quiet? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Heat Stories, because Chapter 4 reveals how Calvin celebrated his false victory and how karma began closing in.
While I was gone, he strutted through my house like a king. He thought the victory was his, but what he didn't know was that karma had already started moving against him. The silence of my home didn't last long. Within days of my absence, Calvin had filled it with noise again, but this time it wasn't the sound of family or laughter. It was the sound of him dragging boxes across the floor, hammering nails into walls, and pacing from room to room as if he had finally claimed a prize he'd chased for years. Neighbors said he walked around like a man who'd conquered something, head high, chest puffed, waving from my porch as though the house had always been his. He replaced curtains, moved furniture, even painted one of the bedrooms. When folks asked why he was living there, he'd shrug and say, "Martin wanted me to keep an eye on things." But no one had ever heard me say that, not once. What Calvin didn't understand is that people notice when a man changes overnight. Angela told me later she drove by one evening and saw him sitting on my porch with a beer in his hand, looking smug. She wanted to scream at him, to demand he leave, but without proof, she was stuck. Instead, she went home crying. And in Cedar Hills, tears like hers turned into whispers that spread fast. Then came the dog. My old shepherd mix, Duke, had been with me for over a decade. Loyal, sharp, and protective. When I disappeared, Angela tried to take him in, but he kept running back to my yard, scratching at the door, waiting for me. But when Calvin moved in, Duke's behavior changed. Every night, without fail, he'd sit outside the house and bark at the door, loud, relentless barking that shook the quiet streets of Cedar Hills. Neighbors tried to calm him, but nothing worked. Duke wasn't barking for attention. He was warning everyone that something was wrong. Calvin hated it. People said he saw him yelling at the dog, throwing water, even threatening to call animal control. But Duke never stopped, as if the dog knew. The first Sunday after Calvin claimed my home, Pastor Bennett delivered a sermon that sent shivers through the congregation. He spoke about greed, about how envy could consume a man until he lost his soul, about how taking what didn't belong to you only led to destruction. People glanced at Calvin sitting in the back pew, arms crossed, jaw tight. He didn't look at anyone. When the service ended, he slipped out before the final hymn. The whispers grew louder after that. Meanwhile, Deborah Whitfield continued her quiet watch. She noted the odd hours Calvin kept, slipping in and out of the garage late at night, loading and unloading boxes, moving things around like a man hiding secrets. She told her sister over the phone, "He's not just living there. He's staging something. Mark my words." But Deborah was careful. She didn't confront him. Instead, she wrote everything down in a notebook she kept by her window. Her patience would prove invaluable later. The turning point came with the medical report. While Calvin was busy hosting small gatherings in my house, yes, gatherings, as if nothing had happened, the hospital ran additional tests on my case. The results showed something chilling. Traces of toxins in my blood. Not from spoiled food, not from the flu, something deliberately introduced. The authorities didn't announce it immediately, but in Cedar Hills, news always finds a way to leak out. And when it did, suspicion turned into outrage. At the diner, folks no longer whispered, they argued openly. Martin was poisoned. You think it's a coincidence Calvin moved in the second he got sick? Who else would benefit? I never trusted that man. Never. Calvin pretended not to hear. He still walked the streets, still waved, but people didn't wave back anymore. Eyes followed him with mistrust. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. For a man who craved respect, that silence was louder than any accusation. But Calvin wasn't just dealing with stares and whispers. His world began to tighten. Angela pressed harder for answers about her father's estate. Deborah kept writing in her notebook. Duke barked every night like clockwork. And then one evening, the sheriff's office received an anonymous tip. Someone, no one knows who to this day, called in and said, "You need to look closer at Calvin Rhodes. He's hiding more than you think." That tip lit a fire under the investigation, and suddenly Calvin's false victories started to crumble. But he had no idea that the walls were closing in faster than he could ever imagine. If someone in your neighborhood moved into a house right after the owner vanished, would you believe their story, or would you suspect foul play? Tell me in the comments. And before we continue, subscribe to Heat Stories because Chapter 5 reveals how the investigation tightened, how secrets surfaced, and how one hidden camera changed everything.
The walls began to close in on him. Neighbors were whispering, detectives were asking questions, and even his own lies started to betray him. What he didn't know was that a single camera, hidden in my garage, would expose everything. The anonymous tip had done its job. The sheriff's department, which had been slow to act before, now put fresh eyes on my case. 2 detectives were assigned to knock on doors, ask questions, and take a closer look at this sudden shift in my life and Calvin's. For weeks, he'd strutted around Cedar Hills like he'd won, but now, every knock at his door, every unexpected phone call, every car that slowed in front of the house made him sweat. Detectives started with the neighbors. They asked when they'd last seen me, who had been around the house, whether anything unusual had happened. Most people hesitated, afraid to point fingers, but Deborah Whitfield didn't. She told them about the late-night box she saw him carry into my garage. She explained how quickly he moved in, how conveniently the timing matched my disappearance, and how his answers never made sense. She even handed them pages from her notebook, each entry stamped with dates and times. The detectives listened closely, and for the first time, Calvin realized that the town wasn't ignoring him anymore. His response? To double down on the lies. He told the detectives I'd been sick for weeks, that he trusted me more than anyone, that I asked him to move in. He painted himself as a good Samaritan caught in a bad situation. But good Samaritans don't get angry when questioned, and that's exactly what Calvin did. His temper flared when one of the detectives pressed him about my medical results. His voice cracked when they asked why he was living in my home instead of checking in with my family. The detectives didn't say it outright, but their notes said enough. Something doesn't add up. That's when Jason Miller, my nephew, came storming back into town. Jason had grown up spending summers at my house. He knew every corner of my yard, every story I'd told at the dinner table. When he heard about my illness and then my sudden disappearance, he dropped everything in Chicago and drove straight to Cedar Hills. And when he arrived, he didn't stay quiet. He stood in front of the house, my house, and shouted, "This doesn't belong to you, Calvin. Where's my uncle?" Neighbors gathered on their porches. Calvin tried to wave it off, pretending Jason was just upset. But Jason wasn't the type to back down. He went straight to the sheriff's office, demanding answers, demanding justice. Jason's persistence lit another fire under the investigation. Meanwhile, Calvin's mask was slipping. He couldn't walk through town without feeling eyes on him. He couldn't go to the diner without overhearing his name hissed in the corner booths. And then the notes started showing up. The first one was simple. "We know what you did." He found it tucked under his front door. The second came a week later. "Your time is running out." This one was slipped into his mailbox. By the third, Calvin was paranoid. He ripped open an envelope to see, "You'll pay for what you did to Martin." His hands shook. His face went pale. For a man who thought he'd won, the pressure was too much. But the real blow came from Jason.
While Calvin paced and panicked, Jason was digging. He spoke to everyone, neighbors, friends, even the mailman. He wanted every detail about my final weeks at home. And then one afternoon, Jason made a discovery that changed everything. He was in the garage, cleaning out old boxes and tools I'd stored, when he noticed something unusual. A small device, tucked high on a shelf, its tiny light still blinking. It was a hidden camera. Jason brought it straight to the detectives. They pulled the footage, not knowing what they'd find. At first, it showed nothing unusual. Me tinkering with tools, organizing shelves, and carrying bags in and out. But then, the timeline shifted. It showed Calvin. He wasn't just helping me. He was tampering with my drinks, handling my food, moving in and out of the house when he thought nobody was watching. The footage painted a picture clearer than any rumor, clearer than any suspicion. Calvin Rods wasn't a neighbor helping a sick man. He was a predator, and my house was his prize. From that moment, everything changed. The sheriff's department had more than whispers and suspicion. They had proof. The investigation tightened around Calvin like a vice. The camera told the story I no longer could, and once the detectives saw it, there was no turning back. Calvin thought he still had time, but his fall was already in motion. If you discovered a hidden camera that exposed your neighbor's darkest secrets, would you hand it over to the police or confront them yourself? Tell me in the comments. And make sure you subscribe to Heat Stories, because in Chapter 6, you'll see how Calvin's world collapsed, how he tried to run, and how karma finally caught him on the road.
The proof was out. The camera showed the truth. He poisoned me, and when the evidence surfaced, his whole world began to collapse. The footage from the garage left no room for doubt. For months, Calvin had walked around Cedar Hills pretending to be a helpful neighbor, a man looking out for me while I was sick. But the camera told a different story. Detectives watched him pour things into my drinks, stir powders into food, and sneak in and out of my garage like a thief. Every gesture, every smirk, every casual glance over his shoulder was frozen on film. When the investigators confronted him with the evidence, Calvin's mask slipped. He tried to deny it at first, claiming it was taken out of context. But context didn't matter when the video showed him leaning over my lemonade with a vial in his hand. And once they had that, the rest of his secrets started coming to light. Detectives pulled his internet history. Late-night searches for toxins, questions like how much does it take to poison someone without being detected, and best ways to make poisoning look natural. They subpoenaed purchase records from local stores. On his receipts, cleaning agents, solvents, and chemicals that had no reason to be in his home. When cross-checked with the toxicology results from my medical tests, the match was undeniable. Every stone they turned revealed more dirt. Calvin began to panic. At first, he tried to bluff his way through, insisting it was all coincidence. But when the detectives didn't buy it, he grew desperate. He stopped showing his face at the diner. He avoided church altogether. He barely left the house except for making frantic late-night runs where he was seen buying things in cash, trying not to leave a trail. The once smug man who waved from my porch was now a shadow, glancing over his shoulder, muttering under his breath, hands shaking when he lit a cigarette. The whispers in town grew louder. People no longer just suspected, they knew. Jason, my nephew, pushed harder than ever. He demanded the sheriff arrest Calvin immediately, but investigators wanted to build the case airtight. They wanted every piece of evidence, every witness, every motive nailed down before they made a move. That patience only drove Calvin further into paranoia. Then came the day he snapped. Neighbors said they saw him loading bags into his truck late at night. He looked frantic, tossing things in without order. Clothes, boxes, papers, anything he could grab. By dawn, he was gone. He didn't get far. Somewhere outside Dayton, his old truck broke down at a gas station. He tried to fix it, cursing and sweating, but by then, the sheriff's department had already been alerted. 2 deputies pulled up as Calvin stood by the hood, hands covered in grease, eyes wide like a cornered animal.
Witnesses said he didn't fight, he just froze, as if he finally realized the game was over. But the true twist came later. As prosecutors prepared the case, digging through Calvin's past, they uncovered something chilling. This wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. Years earlier in Kentucky, Calvin had rented a small apartment from an elderly landlord. The man suddenly became ill, bedridden within months. Rumors swirled, but nothing was proven. The landlord died quietly, and Calvin vanished soon after. Debts unpaid, reputation stained, but never punished. Back then, he slipped away. This time, there would be no escape. The revelation shook Cedar Hills. People realized Calvin wasn't just a bitter man who snapped. He was a predator with a pattern, a man who saw others' homes and lives as prizes to be stolen. And once that history came out, even those who doubted before could no longer defend him. The trial was set. Witnesses lined up. Deborah with her notebook, Angela with her heartbreak, Jason with his fury, detectives with their files, and most damning of all, the footage from that blinking camera in the garage. Calvin sat in his cell waiting, knowing his fall was complete. But the final blow hadn't landed yet. That would come in the courtroom. The evidence was stacked against him. The community demanded justice, and as the trial began, Calvin faced the one thing he couldn't poison or silence: karma itself. If you found out your neighbor had a dark history of hurting people before, how would you react? Would you confront them or let the law handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments. And before we continue, subscribe to Heat Stories, because Chapter 7 reveals the courtroom drama, the final verdict, and how karma came knocking harder than anyone expected.
He thought he'd stolen my life, but in the end, he couldn't escape the one thing that finds us all: karma. The courtroom was packed the day Calvin Rhodes sat in the defendant's chair. Cedar Hills wasn't a big town, but the trial drew everyone. Families filled the benches, reporters lined the aisles. Even people who barely knew me showed up, curious to see the man who had poisoned his neighbor and moved into his house like a thief in the night. Calvin walked in wearing an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists, but his eyes still carried that same smugness. He scanned the crowd as if daring anyone to meet his gaze. When his eyes landed on Jason, my nephew, the smirk faded for just a second. The charges were read aloud: murder, attempted fraud, unlawful possession of toxins. Each word cut through the room like a blade. Calvin shifted uncomfortably, and for the first time since this all began, the weight of his actions seemed to sink in. The prosecution laid it out, methodically. First came the toxicology reports, showing the poisons in my system. Then came the receipts from local stores, the proof of his purchases. Then the internet searches, projected on a screen for everyone to see. But the most powerful evidence was the video from my garage. The jury watched in silence as Calvin appeared on the screen, handling my drinks, sprinkling powders into food, glancing over his shoulder. Every second of that footage hammered the truth home. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't kindness. It was calculated. Witness after witness took the stand. Deborah Whitfield read from her notebook, her voice steady as she described the nights she saw him sneaking around with boxes. The jurors hung on every word. Angela, my daughter, broke down in tears as she told the court how Calvin stood on my porch pretending to belong there while she searched for answers about her father. Her pain turned the air heavy, and even the judge had to pause to regain composure. Jason spoke last, his voice sharp with anger. My uncle was a good man. He gave his whole life to this community, and Calvin poisoned him just to take what wasn't his. He thought he could steal respect. He thought he could steal a home, but what he stole was a life, and for that, he deserves the harshest sentence you can give. The jury watched Calvin closely. For once, he didn't smile. When the defense tried to argue, their words fell flat. They painted him as a desperate man, unlucky, misunderstood. But desperation doesn't buy poison. Misunderstanding doesn't explain a hidden camera catching him red-handed. By the time the lawyers finished, there was no doubt. The jury deliberated only a few hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was clear: guilty on all counts. The sentencing came weeks later, but the courtroom was just as full.
Calvin stood, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. He avoided looking at Jason, avoided Angela, avoided the neighbors who had once waved at him on the street. The judge's words rang out. Calvin Rhodes, for the crimes of premeditated murder, fraud, and unlawful possession of illegal toxins, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps filled the room. Some cried, some clapped. Jason closed his eyes, relief washing over him. But Calvin? He just stared. His eyes swept the room, lingering on each face as if trying to burn the memory of Cedar Hills into his mind. And then, when his eyes hit Jason again, something strange happened. He smiled. A thin, bitter smile. The smile of a man who lost everything but refused to admit defeat. That smile haunted people long after he was led away in chains. When it was over, Cedar Hills began to heal. Jason inherited the house, but he didn't keep it for himself. He turned it into something bigger, a community center in my honor, a place for barbecues, food drives, and town meetings, a place where laughter filled the air again. Neighbors said it felt right, as though my presence lived on in those walls. Duke, my loyal dog, was often seen lying on the porch steps, finally calm. Life in Cedar Hills slowly returned to normal, but people never forgot. They never forgot how envy turned deadly, and they never forgot how karma came knocking when the time was right. And as for Calvin, his story ended in a concrete cell. No porch to sit on, no neighbors to wave at, no respect to cling to. Just a lifetime of staring at four walls, haunted by the very greed that destroyed him. He thought he had taken everything from me, but in the end, all he gained was a prison number. And I leave you with this. Greed blinds, envy poisons, and lies may buy you time, but they never buy you freedom. He poisoned me, moved into my house, and thought he'd beaten everyone. But karma never forgets. It always arrives, and it never knocks gently. It breaks the door down. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think life in prison was enough for Calvin, or should he have faced even harsher punishment? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And don't leave without subscribing to Heat Stories, because stories like this prove one truth. You can hide lies for a while, but karma always comes knocking.